Ontario Diagnostic Days 2022 on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus, Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, Grain Farmers of Ontario, Agris Co-op, BSF Canada, Bear and DeKalb, Corteva and Pioneer, Great Lakes Grain, Mazex, The Mosaic Company, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin. Welcome to Ontario Diagnostic Days, Day 3. On this episode, we're going to share two more presentations that were filmed at the in-field event at the University of Guelph, Ridgetown campus earlier this year. We'll kick things off with OMAFRA's corn specialist Ben Rosser and soil fertility specialist Colin Elgie. Together, Ben and Colin will help you feel the burn as they share tips on how to diagnose fertilizer injury and manage fertilizer in strip tillage. We'll then spend some time with University of Manitoba professor Mario Tenuta. He'll dive into the effects of waterlogging on crop performance. He'll also share management insights from University of Guelph associate professor David Hooker and float out various recovery management strategies for corn, soybeans, and wheat. Again, CEU credits are available for Diagnostic Days. For this episode, we've embedded the QR code directly in the video. You'll see it as you watch. Here's episode number 3.
Welcome to Feel the Burn. This is our corn stop here at Diagnostic Days. I'm Ben Rosser, corn specialist with OMAFRA.
And I'm Colin Elgie, soil fertility specialist with OMAFRA.
And we're trying to look at some stuff in terms of root burn and fertilizer rates and things like that, particularly as it relates to strip tillage with some of our plots here at Diagnostic Days.
Yeah, so we're going to go through a bunch of plots. We've got some different things going on, different rates of fertilizer, and really take a look at how that's affecting the plant's growth and standability.
So our treatments where we've done with the fertilizer, we've used this Dawn Pluribus strip tiller. So it's a Coulter type strip tiller unit mixing soil with fertilizer in those strips for our different fertilizer treatments. So Colin, if I was out looking at this field in our first plot, not a terrible stand, but definitely some need for improvement. We can see we've got some laggard plants behind kind of about the majority, maybe 2/3 of what our plants look like. So obviously some issues going on. In terms of treatments, what's going on here in this plot?
So you're exactly right, Ben. In an ideal situation, we'd have all kinds of plants that are nice, even growth, all emerged same day, same stage. But yeah, in this situation, we are seeing some variability. So this strip was actually our control strip with zero fertilizer applied through the strip tiller. And yeah, we can see right away that, it was late planting, dry conditions. And so our seeding was maybe not in optimal conditions, which is why you're seeing, quite a bit of variability within the stand.
So variability in the stand, but in this case, clearly not related to fertilizer.
Yep, you're exactly right.
So Colin's second plot now, stand-wise, we've still got the laggards and things we did in the first plot we looked at, but clearly growthier, bit nicer looking corn than what we had in our very first plot.
Yeah, you're right, Ben. So that's one of the first things we noticed was it's a little bit taller, a little bit advanced staging. And so in this plot, we actually applied a blended fertilizer, a 6-28-28, at 250 pounds of actual K2O. So the rate that we applied is far above any rate that we would generally recommend. But being Diagnostic Days, we wanted to feel the burn. And in this case, it doesn't really look like we did burn much of the crop.
But certainly, fertilizer burns so environment specific. There's no way we'd ever recommend this as a blanket recommendation because it worked here at Diagnostic Days in 2022.
Exactly. And in dry conditions, less than ideal planting, you're more likely to see that burn. So really, we kind of lucked out here with that very high rate that we put on. And yeah, really what we're seeing so far, I wouldn't expect to see in a general term. All right, so we're standing here in two different plots. From what we can see, they definitely look like something's going on here. They're quite a bit worse than our previous plots. Ben, what's our treatments here?
Yeah, so like you said, Colin, we wanted to feel the burn in this talk. We tried it with potash and we didn't quite get there, but nitrogen, we knew we could do something. So where I'm standing right now, these 4 rows, this is 250 pounds of nitrogen as urea in these strips. And clearly, in this plot, we're starting to see a lot tougher stand than what we saw in our other plots. We can still see that variability in some laggard plants, but definitely more gaps, maybe some more laggards and just a tougher stand in general. And if we shift one over now where you're standing, we're in 500 pounds of nitrogen in the strip. So again, we're at like 1,100 pounds of urea. Again, Diagnostic Days, trying to do the extreme to show some extreme things, something nobody's ever gonna actually do. But clearly we're seeing exceptional burn here. And when we start to dig these plants up, you can definitely find that fertilizer injury that we were trying to look for and trying to show with the audience here today.
Yeah, so we turned the heat up to the max and we are feeling the burn here.
So Colin, as we talked about, we've got plots here with no fertilizer where we don't have a perfect stand. We've got those laggards and that plant-to-plant variability. And we've got plots where we know we've got fertilizer burn and we see similar symptoms. Certainly laggard plants and plant-to-plant variability can be a symptom of fertilizer burn, but it could be other things going on as well. So, when we were talking with the group here today, I think one important thing is what to look for if you're trying to rule in or rule out fertilizer burn, if both of these had represented different fields we went to. So I think, just to start things off, when I go to a field call like this and I'm trying to rule things in or out, I think it's always important to know what actual corn root structure should look like. So we've got our nodal roots here that I think we'll ignore for now because they're not our seedling roots, but they'll come into play with fertilizer burn too. But I think what's really, really important to know is when you have your corn seedling, you've got your seed that germinates, you have your scutellar node, which kind of comes out the side of that seed. Out of the tip end of that node, you get your radicle, which is kind of your largest seedling root. Out of the other end is your mesocotyl, which is kind of your underground stem for the corn. And you might get some seminal roots coming out of that dent end of the kernel as well. And generally we want to see all those structures. We want them to be, kind of white or tannish color and, fairly healthy, rigid, normal looking roots. If we see what we see in this plant here, I think I could rule out that there's any issues with fertilizer burn in this type of field. But of course, if we went to a case where there was, what would you start to see if we were to rule in fertilizer burn?
Yeah, and so like Ben mentioned, there's lots of reasons for variability, and fertilizer burn is definitely one of them. But it can't always be the case that that's your number one cause. So in the case of these seedlings that we've dug up, we can see that first of all we're missing that important radical root coming out the seed, and so it's a matter of being burnt right off. We can see there's some darkened tips there, basically like it was burnt with a match. We can also see coming out towards the shoot, the mesocotyl, there's some dark brown, it looks like it's been dried out, exactly how it sounds with burn. And we can see that because that radical's been burned off, there's been injury there. There's a lot more of these adventitious roots that come out. And so that's another symptom that you can look for to help identify what's really gone on with that seedling. And so to wrap up here, obviously in our plots here we've seen a lot of different symptoms, some fertilizer injury. The strip till system that we used here isn't necessarily the same as every implement that's on the market there. Ben, I guess do you mind talking on some of the different placement fertilizer options that there are? Yeah,
for sure. So again, to recap, we use a coulter machine where we are mixing fertilizer throughout that strip with a coulter machine. But of course, that doesn't represent everything as you mentioned. So we are leading a new project, a Grain Farmer of Ontario funded project to try to look at safety for different types of blends and different types of placements in the strip. So again, as an example, I think all these are going to impact safety in the strip in terms of what you can get away with. But as some examples that we're trying to play around with, we're looking at fertilizer mixed throughout the strip. Fertilizer banded at the 4-inch depth, so maybe somebody who wants to get some starter fertilizer effect by not putting it all deep. Fertilizer, if we're looking at banding 6 inches down, so Obviously lots of more safety the deeper you go, but maybe losing some of the starter fertilizer effect. And then not common from commercial machines, but looking at double banded. There are some growers in Ontario using this strategy as well, where they're putting fertilizer on both edges of the strip. So some work we're doing, and a huge thanks to Grain Farmers of Ontario for funding this research, and the exceptional help I've got from my summer student and the growers that we're working with on this project.
Mario Tenuta here, Ontario Crop Diagnostics Day, talking about waterlogging in corn and soybeans. Starting off with soybean here. Here we have a demo by my colleague Dave Hooker, where we have 2 rows post-germination being waterlogged, water been added continuously, and to the flanks here, soybean without waterlogging. And what can we see here? You can see yellowing, slight yellowing to the leaves. Got some chlorosis happening. We're having a little less taller plants, shorter plants happening here, maybe even by a node in terms of shorter, and not as bushy as well. So what's going on here? Waterlogging, soybean. Well, soybean's supposed to fix its own nitrogen, isn't it? Well, why isn't it? Well, it's about the roots. The plant and the roots need to feed the bacteria to do the nodulation, to produce the nitrogen. And the plants here are stressed. They're really, they're seeking out, they need as much oxygen as possible. Feeding the bacteria to produce the nitrogen is just something that will just add to more stress at the moment for them. So they're not doing it as much. And hence, the plants are starved for nitrogen. There's another reason as well. Soybean also picks up soil nitrogen. It just doesn't only rely what they fix on their own. So the waterlogging is also causing an issue with loss of nitrogen generally in the soil. So the plant is not only going to have less nitrogen from the fixation, but also less nitrogen that's available in the soil that soybean would pick up as well. And we can see that difference in the root system here, where we have the non-waterlogged plants, nice extensive root system. We can see that root development nicely. We can see a lot of nice nodules, very large nodules on the lateral roots and extending not just on the taproot. Whereas in that waterlogged situation, the nodules are more around that taproot, and you can look at the root system there. It's just not as plentiful. It's just not able to extend. It's staying at the soil surface where there's more oxygen, but not going lower down. Again, not scavenging for nitrogen, not scavenging for phosphorus and other nutrients as well. All right, let's turn our attention now to the corn story with waterlogging. Here's an example from the literature of waterlogging early on. We're talking here at the time of emergence, where we have from no flooding to 7 days of waterlogging flooding occurring. And you can see quite a dramatic difference here. This early stage waterlogging resulting in really poor emergence, and we can see a heavily delayed corn crop occurring here. This corn crop here probably will not be able to recover very well at all here. You may have to do some heavy rescue intervention of nitrogen and do that fast if we're going to have a chance of really pulling out and getting a good corn crop here. Here, you can see just in terms of the phenology and the growth of the corn, of the impact of that waterlogging. The 2 weeks, quite reduced, almost the same number of leaves, but you can see there's quite a difference in growth, and you can see the difference in color that's occurring here. Waterlogging occurring later on in corn stages results in heavy chlorosis and yellowing here. This is now an effect of nitrogen limitation when the corn is really needing it. And in this case here, we're actually getting to the stage where even a rescue is going to be challenging to even pull off decent yield. Now what is happening here in terms of to the corn in terms of nitrogen limitation. What is the waterlogging doing? Well, like the soybean, it's compromising the root system to be able to be active and explore the soil, take up water with nitrate, and bring it up to the canopy. Other is that we're having nitrogen lost in the soil. The nitrogen applied at plant or pre-plant has been nitrified. It's a nitrate, it's in a mobile form that can be lost. It can be lost as leaching in our light textured soils as the water will drain away. And secondly, it can be lost via denitrification, where soil bacteria consume that nitrate because of the waterlogged conditions, and we can lose quite a significant amount of nitrogen. Now, how much nitrogen? It's going to vary with the soil, with the degree of the waterlogging or the wet conditions, and it's going to vary depending if we're having leaching or denitrification. So in the situation here in soils here at the Ridgetown campus, we have clay underneath, a surface layer of a silt or clay loam soils. We're not going to have tremendous amount of leaching right here, but it'd be more losses through denitrification. And what encourages denitrification? Well, something like today, with warm, hot conditions, getting those microbes very active. Secondly, we need that wet conditions to starve them of oxygen where they need to use nitrate. And the very third thing is organic matter in soil. We need to feed those microbes. So high soil organic matter is one way of feeding them. Lots of residues is another, crop residues. And the third is, for example, a history of manure application, but not any kind of manure application. It'd be solid manure application where we're really increasing our organic matter. So those three can really cause losses of denitrification. Now, how much? It varies, but we're talking, when I say significant, I am talking about 10, 20, 30, in some cases maybe even more than that in terms of denitrification. You get a situation like this where we have yellowing, you're going to be in many tens of pounds of nitrogen to cause this kind of yellowing and chlorosis. What are some things that can be done? Here's an example of tiling, and this is a really water affected field, and you can really, this is early on in the growing season, you can really see those tile lines causing the drying and causing the impact on that early season growth here. You'll probably see a remnant effect of this in terms of waves in the field along with the tile lines in terms of performance with this wheat crop. Now, we talked about being able to lose significant amounts of nitrogen through nitrate. What can we do? Well, we talked about rescue nitrogen. There's possibility of going in and rescuing, but rescuing is really a situation where we've put nitrogen on, we've committed up front with our nitrogen and we've lost it, and we want to now provide a Band-Aid solution of adding more nitrogen back. But one thing that farmers can do is do a split application, especially with corn, where we lower your risk of losing that early season nitrogen investment by splitting your application into the season. So in Ontario, good half of the producers, if not slightly more, are using split application of their nitrogen. Going on with a second application, V8 to V12 in terms of the nitrogen. And what that does is we have waterlogging or wet conditions early on, post-emergence in that early vegetative state. We don't have all our nitrogen at risk to being lost through leaching and denitrification. It just reduces that risk. Well, how about that in-season application? How can we reduce losses there? Because they will still be prone to loss. And one of the big challenges is ammonia loss in season. Why? Because our forms of nitrogen that we apply and use, such as urea and UAN, can volatilize with ammonia leaving to the atmosphere. And secondly, it's because we often choose to apply those products at the soil surface. Some of it's logistics and some of it's for convenience. But what can we do? Well, there's a couple of things. Growers can broadcast urea onto their fields. That probably has the highest risk of loss of ammonia, followed by streaming or dribbling of UAN as a second Another is with corn with wide drops, which is putting a stream of UAN at the base of the stem of the corn plant, kind of mimic like rainfall, moving from the stem into the root system. And the third, which is probably the best for reducing chance of ammonia loss, is injection of UAN. So we're talking, or even side dress of urea, but UAN would be more common. And there we have very little chance of ammonia loss. Now, if it rains after application, it doesn't matter how you applied your nitrogen. So I go by a rule of thumb, if it rains within 3 days of your application in season, chances of significant ammonia losses are probably small. But as soon as it gets more than 3 days, in fact, we're in mid-season and it's warm, you get a day like this with some wind, you can increase your chance of volatilization because of that warm temperatures and the high winds. So in that situation, if we don't have rains, we can lose quite a bit of our nitrogen. How much? It varies. We're talking probably around 10 to 30 pounds potentially of nitrogen, okay? Now, what can we do to protect it? One possibility is you have to apply at the surface. Can you use a urease inhibitor product that stabilizes the urea and prevents it to going to ammonia, to volatilize, and increasing that window where you get a chance for rain to occur to wash in that nitrogen. Now, how much rain do we need to wash in? Well, probably about a good 3/4 of an inch. That is going to move that nitrogen a good 1.5 to 2 inches into the soil at least. And that's great to reduce that loss of ammonia to volatilization. So the urease inhibitors can work there very well if you get rain at some point. If you do not get rain, period, you have stranded nitrogen, and then nothing's going to really help getting that nitrogen to that root system, because that root system is going down, down, down for water, and the nitrogen's stranded at the surface. Okay? But one thing to keep in mind, if you're using these products to stabilize and increase your nutrient nitrogen use efficiency, consider, do you need to be applying at the old rate that you've been accustomed to? Because chances are your old rate has been figured out to account for losses. And if you're reducing your losses, you need to think about, can you alter your rates then to and hopefully cover the cost premium of the product. I want to make sure we don't forget about this really important point about ammonia loss, and that is, in terms of injection, are all injections equal in terms of reducing ammonia volatilization? No, they're not. A key thing, there's two key things actually, not just two. We need depth. From work from the literature, at least 3 inches. Getting nitrogen in 3 inches below the surface really reduces the risk of ammonia loss. And actually by 4, it's 0. But there's a catch. You need to have closure. Okay? Gotta close the slot, and that becomes important, because if the slot is open, there's a chance now the ammonia can go straight to the atmosphere. It's still going to the atmosphere. Now, what happens, problematic on clay soils, and this is where it's really tricky, where you have, it dries and the slots can open up when they crack. And that can be problematic still. So when we're talking here about closure, make sure you have good coverage and that those slots are not going to open up after that injection. Last point about nitrification, waterlogging, and loss of nitrogen. We have this window. It's a huge risk window from planting to when corn really starts to kick in to take up its nitrogen. And when does that occur? Well, we're starting to talk about V10, V12, when it starts to ramp and really gear up, pulling in nitrogen. That window there, if we've applied our nitrogen early on at planting, it can be lost through leaching and denitrification. We can do some management to control that. One is the split application, where we delay a portion of our application to later to coincide with the timing of that application, the timing of the corn need of nitrogen, and don't have that nitrogen exposed to that early season losses. The second is we could use a nitrification inhibitor at planting, and even if we go very early in vegetative stage, if we're going at V6 or some of that, we could still use a nitrification inhibitor. And what that does, it stabilizes the nitrogen, keeps it in ammonium form, which doesn't leach because it sticks to soil. And secondly, it is not prone to denitrification because it is not nitrate. That's extra insurance to the grower to not lose that nitrogen investment up front that they've made. Again, just like the urease inhibitor story, if we use a nitrification inhibitor to prevent that nitrification early on, you got to ask yourself, am I reducing losses, and therefore should I readjust my rates of nitrogen addition to account for that? Ideally, I like to see getting back the premium of the cost of the nitrification inhibitor in terms of savings on nitrogen rates.
There you have it. Hope you've enjoyed episode 3 of Ontario Diagnostic Days. If you have any questions for our presenters, we'd love to hear from you. You can put those questions directly in our comments box on YouTube, or look for the contact information at the end of the video. Our next episode is September 28th. We will see you then.
Ontario Diagnostic Days 2022 on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus, Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, Grain Farmers of Ontario, Agris Co-op, BSF Canada, Bear and DeKalb, Corteva and Pioneer, Great Lakes Grain, Mazex, The Mosaic Company, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta.